A 15-second video, no date stamp, no location, released by a state news agency on a Sunday, showing a man speaking quietly with a small group of officials, and almost nothing else. This is not proof of health. This is not proof of control. What this actually is, at its core, is the latest move in a months-long pattern where Iran's own state media keeps trying to answer a question it has never fully answered: whether the country's new supreme leader is actually capable of running the country he now nominally leads. I'm going to walk you through exactly what's known, why the absence itself was always the real center of gravity in this succession story, and why what happens in the next few weeks inside Iran's power structure is going to matter more than anything we've covered on this channel so far. Stay with me for all of it. Before we go any further, I want to be straight with you about what I actually know here, because that matters more to me than sounding dramatic. Some of what I'm walking you through is confirmed, drawn from state media statements and public appearances, or the lack of them, that multiple independent outlets have documented consistently. Some of it is reported by credible sources, but not independently verified, particularly anything involving his physical condition. And some of it is my own professional read on how succession crises like this tend to unfold based on watching similar power vacuums play out elsewhere. I'll flag which is which as we go. No hype, no speculation dressed up as fact. Let's get into it. To understand why one man's public absence can destabilize an entire government, you first have to understand how the role he holds actually functions, because almost nobody outside the region explains this part clearly. The position of supreme leader in Iran isn't simply a ceremonial post sitting above an otherwise independent government. It's the keystone of the entire system, the office that appoints the heads of the judiciary, the armed forces, and state media, and whose authority theoretically outranks the elected president on matters of national security and foreign policy. The president depends on the supreme leader's backing to hold real authority over the military and intelligence services. The military depends on the supreme leader as the final word in disputes between competing factions. And state media depends on the supreme leader's office for the narrative authority that keeps competing power centers from openly contradicting each other in public. Remove the person actually occupying that keystone position, or even leave serious doubt about whether he's capable of occupying it, and the whole structure has to find some other way to hold itself together. It helps to think of the office less like a single powerful individual and more like a load-bearing wall in a building where every other wall was designed assuming that one would always be standing. You can shore up the surrounding structure temporarily. Other officials can absorb some of the decision-making, competing factions can informally divide responsibilities, state media can keep projecting an image of continuity. But none of that is a permanent substitute for the wall itself. And the longer that substitution has to hold, the more visible the strain becomes in exactly the places we're about to walk through. And here's the recontextualizing piece almost nobody talks about. Most people assume that a leadership vacuum like this would show up immediately as chaos, competing announcements, open infighting, a visible scramble for power. That's not really what's happened here. That itself is the more revealing detail. What's happened instead is something quieter and, in some ways, more telling. The president is given contradicting accounts of his own access to the supreme leader within the space of weeks, describing contact as growing easier at one point, and then, shortly after, describing it as very difficult. That kind of contradiction from the second highest official in the country isn't chaos in the dramatic sense. It's the sound of a system trying to project normalcy while privately unsure of the answer itself. Consider what it would take for that kind of contradiction to happen at all. The president of a country doesn't casually misstate his access to the single most powerful person in the government, not once and certainly not twice within the same month, unless the underlying situation is genuinely fluid enough that even people close to the center of power aren't entirely sure how to characterize it from one week to the next. That's a very different picture than either extreme people tend to jump to. It's not confirmation that something catastrophic happened, but it's also not nothing. And treating it as nothing requires ignoring exactly the kind of behavioral pattern that, in past succession crises elsewhere, has tended to precede much bigger public admissions, months down the line. That's the mechanism in short form. One office holds the structural keystone, and doubt about that office cascades outward through every institution built to depend on it. Here's the longer version, and the one that actually explains why this story has stayed alive for months, instead of resolving one way or the other. Mojtaba Khamenei was elevated to supreme leader in March, following the assassination of his father during the opening days of the war with Israel and the United States earlier this year, a strike that also killed dozens of other senior Iranian officials in a single, unprecedented decapitation event. He was reportedly injured in that same strike, and in the months since assuming the role, he has not appeared in public even once, not at his own father's funeral, not at any state occasion, nowhere that independent cameras or verified footage could confirm his presence. That absence sits against a backdrop worth understanding on its own terms, because the strike that killed his father wasn't an isolated assassination in the way that phrase usually implies. It was part of a broader wave of strikes early in the war that killed dozens of senior Iranian officials within an extremely compressed window, a decapitation event on a scale that forced the country's clerical establishment to select a new supreme leader under conditions unlike anything the modern Islamic Republic had faced before. Whatever else is true or unverified about Mojtaba Khamenei's personal condition, he inherited the role during what was, by any measure, the single most destabilizing period Iran's leadership structure has experienced since the revolution itself. Now, let's talk about how this has actually unfolded month by month, because the sequence matters just as much as any single data point, and almost none of the coverage lays it out cleanly in order. In March, following his appointment by Iran's clerical selection body, Khamenei was formally announced as the country's third supreme leader, succeeding his father. But he did not appear publicly to mark the transition, which, even at the time, drew quiet notice, given how significant that kind of transfer of authority normally is in the Iranian system. In May, state media reported that President Pezeshkian had met with him for several hours, the first publicly reported meeting between the two men since the succession, described afterward in state coverage as focused on economic and military matters. And critically, that meeting did not include any released photograph, audio, or video confirming it took place as described. In late June and early July, Khamenei's absence became impossible to ignore on a much larger scale when he did not attend his own father's funeral proceedings in Tehran, an event that drew significant public and political attention specifically because his absence there was so conspicuous. Iranian officials attributed the no-show to security concerns, but roughly a month later, in early August, the story shifted again. Pezeshkian told a state broadcaster that reaching the supreme leader had become very difficult, a comment that immediately reignited speculation that had never fully died down. And then, within days of that comment spreading, Pezeshkian revised his account, describing a lengthy meeting with Khamenei lasting 7 or 8 hours, again without independent confirmation. And around the same time, a paramilitary official promised that footage of the supreme leader would be released showing him out among the public. Here's the piece. Almost nobody's explaining correctly in the way this story keeps getting summarized. This isn't a single dramatic disappearance. It's a pattern of contradiction repeating on a roughly monthly cycle: absence, then a promise of proof, then a brief and often unverifiable claim of contact, then renewed doubt. That cyclical pattern is arguably more revealing than any single missed appearance would be on its own, because it suggests a government that keeps needing to reassure the public, and quite possibly its own internal factions, that the man at the top of the system is still functionally there. Compare this to how genuine confirmations of a leader's status usually get handled when a government actually wants to put speculation to rest permanently. A clear, dated, verifiable public appearance, ideally with independent journalists present or at minimum unedited footage with confirmable time and location markers, tends to end this kind of story almost overnight elsewhere. What we've seen instead, month after month, is closer to the opposite pattern. Short clips, no dates, no locations, filtered entirely through state channels with no independent verification path available. Whether that choice reflects genuine incapacity, deliberate information control, or some combination of both, it's a decision worth weighing against how badly a government facing this level of sustained speculation would presumably want the story to simply disappear. There are 3 separate tracks worth pulling apart here because they're being reported as one confusing blur in most coverage right now. Track 1 is the confirmed public record: appointment in March, no public appearances since, absence from his father's funeral, and Pezeshkian's contradictory public statements about contact. Track 2 is the officially claimed but unverified track: the reported multi-hour meetings, the promised footage, the brief undated video clips released by state outlets that show him only in short, low-resolution clips without any independently confirmable date or location. Track 3 is the speculative track, running loudest of all 3 online, built around unconfirmed reports that he suffered serious injury, including facial disfigurement, in the same strike that killed his father, a claim that has circulated widely through multiple outlets citing unnamed sources. But that remains, as of now, unconfirmed by any independently verifiable evidence. If this breakdown is giving you the kind of clarity you can't get from a headline built entirely around track 3, do one thing right now. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell, because this succession story is still unresolved and I'll be tracking every real development as it happens, not just recycling the loudest rumor of the week. So let's zoom out, because a leadership vacuum like this never stays contained to one man's public schedule for long. It escalates outward in stages, and each stage is a direct downstream consequence of the one before it, never a lateral jump to some unrelated headline. At the local level, the immediate consequence is bureaucratic ambiguity, officials across multiple ministries reportedly uncertain in recent months about which decisions require the supreme leader's direct sign-off and which can proceed through other channels. A genuinely destabilizing kind of uncertainty inside any government built around a single final authority. Bureaucracies built on a single point of final approval don't handle that kind of ambiguity gracefully, even under far less strained circumstances than a nation recovering from a war that killed dozens of its top officials. Decisions that would normally move quickly through a clear chain of authority instead stall while officials try to determine who, in practice, is empowered to sign off in the supreme leader's continued absence. That kind of institutional friction rarely makes headlines on its own. It shows up instead as slower policy implementation, delayed appointments, and the kind of quiet administrative drag that outside observers usually only notice in hindsight, once enough of it has accumulated to visibly affect how the government functions day to day. At the national level, the consequence is a very public struggle for narrative control, with competing factions inside Iran's political establishment reportedly maneuvering to assert influence during a period where the ultimate check on their power has gone largely silent, according to multiple outlets tracking internal Iranian politics closely over the summer. That struggle for narrative control matters more than it might initially seem, because in a system built around deference to a single ultimate authority, prolonged ambiguity about that authority's status creates exactly the kind of opening competing factions have historically used to expand their own influence, quietly and incrementally, in ways that can be difficult to reverse once the succession question is eventually settled one way or another. Whoever ends up best positioned when clarity finally arrives, whether that's confirmation of Khamenei's full capacity or an acknowledgement that some other arrangement has effectively taken over, will likely have spent these intervening months building exactly the kind of institutional leverage that outlasts any single news cycle. At the regional level is where this genuinely gets consequential, because neighboring states and rival powers alike have built their own strategic assumptions around who actually holds final authority inside Iran at any given moment. Extended ambiguity at the top changes that calculation, and reporting on the region's response to this uncertainty tends to cluster into three recognizable patterns. Some governments are reportedly recalibrating their diplomatic approach, treating the uncertainty itself as reason for caution rather than escalation. Others appear to be testing the limits of the moment more directly, and it's worth noting that Iran's allied forces in Yemen reportedly increased attacks on Red Sea shipping during the same stretch of ambiguity, a timing correlation multiple analysts have flagged as worth watching, rather than dismissing as coincidence. And a third group of regional actors have used the moment to accelerate their own alignments, with reports of new defense arrangements being finalized between other regional powers during this same window, the kind of realignment that tends to happen when the balance of power in a region looks less settled than it did a year earlier. At the global level, the uncertainty has bled directly into some of the most consequential ongoing negotiations in the region, including talks over reopening the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran has reportedly continued to tie any reopening to conditions involving the United States, even as the identity and capacity of the person ultimately authorizing that position remains genuinely unclear to outside observers. This is the same corridor we broke down in our last analysis on the tracking anomaly near Hormuz, if you remember that one. The through line connecting these stories isn't coincidental. A region already operating under sustained uncertainty tends to generate exactly this kind of overlapping, compounding ambiguity across multiple fronts at once. I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further, because it's easy to treat a succession story like this as pure palace intrigue and lose sight of what's actually underneath it. Whatever has or hasn't happened to Mojtaba Khamenei personally, the uncertainty around him is unfolding inside a country still absorbing the aftermath of a war that killed dozens of its senior officials in a matter of days, a country where ordinary people are navigating worsening living standards that Khamenei himself has reportedly identified as a pressing concern in whatever contact he has had with the president. Understanding the power struggle at the top doesn't require pretending that the uncertainty and hardship experienced by people far from that struggle isn't equally real. Both things are true at once. You can take this seriously as a story about institutional stability and still hold on to the fact that a nation full of people are living through the consequences of a vacancy at the top that nobody outside a small circle can actually confirm the full truth about. I keep coming back to that detail about worsening living standards specifically, because it's the part of this story that gets buried fastest under the more dramatic speculation about disfigurement and hidden video. Whatever is or isn't true about the man himself, the economic strain his own government has acknowledged is real, ongoing, and largely disconnected from whether the answer to the succession question turns out to be dramatic or mundane. That's worth sitting with for a moment before we move to where this leaves us. Here's where we stand. A 15-second video with no date and no location is the most recent attempt by Iranian state media to answer a question that has now persisted for months, not days in the narrow sense, but months of accumulating doubt that keeps resurfacing in fresh cycles, exactly like the one driving headlines again this week. Mojtaba Khamenei has not made a single independently verified public appearance since assuming the role in March. He was absent from his own father's funeral, The president himself has given contradicting public accounts of how easily he can even reach the man who's supposed to hold final authority over the entire government. Is Iran's leadership already collapsing from within? The honest answer, the one that resists the temptation to overclaim in either direction, is that nobody outside a very small circle actually knows for certain. And that uncertainty, sustained this long at the very top of a major regional power, is itself the story, regardless of how it eventually resolves. If this gave you a clearer picture than you'd get from a 30-second clip built entirely around the disfigurement rumor, share it right now with someone actually trying to understand what's happening inside Iran's power structure instead of just scrolling past the scariest version of the headline. And I genuinely want to hear from you on this one. Do you think this pattern of promised footage followed by renewed doubt is a government buying time for a leader who's genuinely incapacitated, or a deliberate strategy to keep rival factions guessing about who actually holds power? And which explanation do you find more convincing based on everything we just walked through? Drop your take in the comments below. I read every single one and hit like if this analysis delivered real value to you today. There's more coming on this story, and probably sooner than you'd expect given the monthly pattern we've tracked here. Watch for whether the promised footage of Khamenei among the people actually materializes with a verifiable date and location, because that single detail will tell you more than another round of official statements ever could. I'll be here the moment it moves. Stay close.